Hi, I'm Traci Hoffman. I'm a reference librarian at Mentor Public Library, and today I'm doing a presentation on two women who have very famous sisters, Maria Romanov, whose sister is Anastasia, who may or may not have survived the Romanov execution and been the last Grand Duchess of Russia, and Margot Frank, whose sister is Anne Frank, one of the symbols of young women that died in the Holocaust. These two women also have their own interesting stories, and I am going to share that with you today. So first we're going to go to Maria Romanov. She was actually born June 26th, 1899, and she is one of the last Grand Duchesses of Russia. She often is forgotten amongst her famous siblings, but she is actually the glue of this family. She was a fast and easy birth. Her father remarked it was over quite quickly in his diary. She was born at Peterhof Palace, and that's a series of palaces in Peterhof, Russia, in St. Petersburg, and they were built by Peter the Great in a direct response to Versailles, which was built by Louis XIV of France. She was the third daughter of the Russian imperial family, so it could be considered that her birth was a bit of a disappointment. They had all hoped for an heir. However, her father was really not that concerned about it. He was very happy, regardless of her gender. Queen Victoria, on the other hand, said, "I regret the third girl for a country. I know that an heir would be much more welcome." But her father said, "A happy day. The Lord has sent us a third daughter, Maria, who was safely born at 12:10. I only managed to get out into the fresh air after dinner, and the evening was marvelous." She and her father actually became very close. In her early life, she was actually nicknamed Little Bow Wow. It is about her strong build, just like her grandfather's Alexander III, and also her sweet nature. She was always very giving and loving towards others, and sometimes taken advantage of for that reason. She had big, beautiful eyes, which were called Maria's saucers, and she was arguably the most beautiful of the family. Her mother actually took an active role in her upbringing. She actually breastfed, which was scandalous in those days, but she had nannies and tutors as well. And she loved art, not so much school. She was not really into her studies, but she did love painting watercolors. She and her sisters were called Atma, standing for Olga, Tatiana, Maria, and Anastasia. They were kind of a unit together. And she actually wanted to fall in love and marry a soldier. Her governess, Margareta Egger, said one day Maria ran to the window to look at all the soldiers and said, "I want to kiss them all." She did not care about status, which is actually very interesting considering the time period. And she was, after all, a royal and expected to marry someone with some sort of status. And her dream of marrying a soldier occurred at a very young age. So in regards to her parents, her father was Nicholas II, the last Tsar or Emperor of Russia. And her mother was Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, Princess of Hesse and Rhine. And her mother was actually raised in a part of Germany, but she had a very sad upbringing. Her mother and youngest sister died of diphtheria when Alex was 6, and her father died when she was 19. So Queen Victoria actually acted as a surrogate mother for her, and Alex actually moved to London. She did have numerous health issues throughout her life. Both Maria's parents were actually grandchildren of Queen Victoria, and they very much sheltered their children. They were very rarely seen by the public. So here's a little family tree about how Nicholas and Princess Alex were related. And you can see they're both grandchildren of Queen Victoria. We'll talk about why Nicholas's mother was called Dagmar at first, and her name was changed to Marie later. So the only grandmother alive, or grandparent at all, that Maria actually ever met was her grandmother, Maria Feodorovna. And she was originally from Denmark and actually named Dagmar. And she was Princess Dagmar of Schleswig, Holstein, Sonderburg, and Glucksburg. She and her husband, Tsar Alexander III, actually loved each other, and they were third cousins. But she actually was engaged to Alexander's older brother before he died at age of 21. Nicholas actually said on his deathbed that he wanted his younger brother to marry the woman he was engaged to. They later did not actually approve of Tsar Nicholas II's, their son's, marriage to Alexandra of Hesse and Rhine. They actually did not get along at all, which complicated matters. They thought she was shy and peculiar, but Marie was actually rescued in 1919 after the Romanov execution, and she actually went to England. So Maria's governesses and nursemaids consisted of Margareta Egger, an Irish lady, and was her nurse until 1904. Maria actually once escaped from the bath when Margareta was talking about politics and ran naked throughout the palace. Margareta also taught the girls English. She really adored those girls, and she talked with them until their deaths. Alexandra Tegleva was a nanny and nurse to the children and later wife of their French tutor, Peter Gilar. Sofia Ivanovna Tayucheva became a companion to Otma in 1907 until she resigned in 1912. She reported Grigory Rasputin had access to the nursery when the girls were in their nightgowns, and she was horrified. She told other members of the imperial family. Maria Ivanovna Vishnayakova claimed that Rasputin actually raped her. The Empress did not believe her, and eventually she was dismissed in 1913. So Maria's relationship with Olga and Tatiana was interesting because Olga and Tatiana actually were best friends. They were known as the big pair. They really did love Maria, although they did tease her quite a bit when they were younger. They one day made a house with chairs and shut Maria out, telling her maybe she could be a footman and should stay outside. Margareta Egger made a house for Maria with Anastasia when Anastasia was a baby, but Maria kept looking at Olga and Tatiana's house. She really got upset and dashed across the room and rushed into the house and slapped them both. She said, "I won't be a footman. I'll be a kind, good aunt who brings presents." And that day, they learned to treat her better and found her a place in the family. So she was closest, obviously, with Anastasia, as she was paired with her, and they were called the little pair. Anastasia was a prankster, and she often made pranks during royal engagements. Maria followed her, often apologizing for those pranks. With Alexey, she took care of him, as everybody else did in the family. But she was the strongest, and he would always ask her, "Mashka, carry me." And she often worried about Anastasia's closeness with Alexey. It was a very natural closeness, and she was worried she had no place in the family. One day she wrote to her mother about such worries, and her mother wrote back, "Sweet child, you must promise me never again to think that nobody loves you. How did such an extraordinary idea get into your little head? Get it quickly out again." So the figure we've all been waiting for, Grigory Rasputin, was a mystic healer, and he appears in St. Petersburg around 1903. And he already had a following as a mystic and faith healer. He was introduced to the royal family, and Nicholas and Alexandra were very desperate to help get a cure, just any healing in general, for Alexey, who had hemophilia and was very sick. Maria actually respected Rasputin just like every other member of the family. She wrote letters to him. He's often mentioned in her diary. And the other girls, the older girls, even asked him for advice. And rumors started actually spreading about him in 1909. But he was also used as a tool to undermine the royal family and push for reform. His close relationship really hurt them in the way that they had a reason to have dislike for the royal family. He was assassinated eventually in 1916, and one of their cousins was actually part of the assassination. So we do have some surviving diaries and letters of Maria's that exist from 1908 to 1919. And before leaving Tobosulk, Maria and Anastasia destroyed their diaries, but there are several of Maria's that survive, and they were actually made into a book and translated into English. So they give a glimpse into her daily life, what her routine was. And these letters often give a bit of what her personality was like. So from these letters and diary entries, we can kind of put pieces together of what type of Grand Duchess or person Maria was. So in 1909 and 1910, they visited a lot of their extended family, and they did official visits abroad, which was unusual for the girls and Alexey. So they went to the Isle of Wight, and they met with the British royal family. So they would see Alexander VII, Edward VII, they would see George V, and Mary of Teck. They went to Hohenzollern and met with Wilhelm II, the Kaiser there. They went to Friedberg and Hesse, Germany, and they met the Battenberg family. So if you know about Prince Philip, they met his extended family. He wasn't born yet, but they met his uncle, Louis Mountbatten. And Louis Mountbatten actually developed a very large crush on Maria. And he said he was crackers about Maria and determined to marry her. She was absolutely lovely, and I keep her photograph in my bedroom. I always have. And we actually have a New Year's postcard and Christmas card that Maria and Anastasia wrote to him. It was interesting that he also eventually was assassinated in 1979. We don't know if his crush on Maria was reciprocated, but they were good friends regardless. A recurring theme that you'll see in letters to her mother and diary entries is Maria's worry about her mother's health. And her mother, the Empress, had poor health throughout her life. And there were occasions where she was actually isolated from the family, and they were unable to see her. So Alexandra actually asked Rasputin not only for help with Alexey, but herself as well, and even other members of the family when they were ill. In 1912, Maria became of age, and she was given her own regiment, the 5th Kazanki Dragoons, and she could review her own troops, and she often signed her name as Kazanets in letters to her father, showing her appreciation for being given the regiment and also that she was honored to have it. The Romanov Tercentenary was celebrating 300 years of the Romanov dynasty. There were celebrations countrywide in St. Petersburg. The receptions lasted a week, and people gathered from all over, the princes from the Baltic and Poland, tribal chiefs from Central Asia, and mullahs. Streets were decorated in red, white, and blue, and there were signs saying, "God save the Tsar." Factories actually closed, and there were a few different balls celebrating the occasion. So the pilgrimage that they went on actually followed the route of Macaulay I after his election in 1613. They visited ancient towns associated with the founding of the dynasty. They also went to Moscow, and they had a ball there. However, the Empress had gastritis, and Alexey collapsed at that ball. But the goal of these occasions was actually to get support for the imperial family and keep it going, and showing that it was still strong after all this time, which we know it was not. Soon after the Tercentenary, World War I began, and Maria and Anastasia were too young, actually, to become nurses like their older sisters. So they visited soldiers in the hospitals and played games with them, cards and checkers, chess, to lift their spirits. And at that time, it was when Rasputin was murdered. So in 1917, the February Revolution took place, and it lasted 8 days of chaotic, violent clashes with the police. And people were voicing discontent with the monarchy over food rations. Actually, people were starving, and the troops actually sided with the revolutionaries. And 3 days later, Nicholas had to abdicate. The family was imprisoned at Alexander Palace, at Tobolsk, and then Yekaterinburg. Maria, throughout this time, still talked with the guards and tried to remain positive. Even in her letters, you can see that she is very positive that someday she will get out and she will have a normal life again. Sometimes the guards were unkind to the girls that were there, and one day they were in particular, not very good with Tatiana. So Maria actually stands up for her sister and says, "Why are you not disgusted with yourselves when you use such shameful words? Do you imagine that you can woo a well-born woman with such witticisms and have her be well-disposed towards you? Be refined and respectable men, and then we can get along." Maria had many suitors or love interests during her time when she was alive. And Prince Carol was supposed to be a suitor for Olga. He was Prince of Romania, but he preferred Maria. It was actually her first royal engagement, and she slipped and fell, but she laughed and laughed over it. And this was in 1916. She was actually wearing a blue dress and diamonds for that banquet. And Carol did ask Nicholas for permission to marry Maria, and he laughed and said she was still a schoolgirl. Then there was Ivan Skorohodov. There's a story that for her last birthday, he gave Maria a cake and planned an escape with her. She was very popular with the guards, and he was actually dismissed, but we don't know if there was any truth to the story. He left actually really in reality due to illness. Then there was Nikolai Demenkov, who was nicknamed Fatso. He was a Marine Corps lieutenant who was on the Imperial Yacht Standard. They met in 1913, and her feelings were released from 1915 until her death. He actually ended up moving to Paris and never marrying. It's obvious she was very much in love with him because she signed all her letters to her father, Mrs. Demenkov. So the house with special purpose was Epitaph House, and it was a 2-story stone house, and it was on the Ascension Hill in Yekaterinburg. And Maria was the first of the girls to come. She came with her parents, and then the other girls came later. They actually ordered the family that was living there to leave their home, and they replaced the Romanovs in there. And the Romanovs lived there for 70 days, until one day they were ordered into the basement and executed by firing squad. The execution itself lasted 30 minutes, and even years later, you could still see the blood in the walls. The house no longer exists. It was demolished. The bodies were buried at Poroshenko Lodge, and they were found there in 1979. However, there were 2 bodies missing, and that's where the legend that there were some survivors comes from. They actually buried them 50 feet away. They were found in 2007, and those bodies believed to be Alexey and Maria. They did a lot of reconstruction and DNA evidence with the bones, and they found out it was actually a girl between the ages of 19 and 23, which matches up with Maria's age, as Anastasia was only around 16 when she died. There were actually several theories about survival with all the girls, and the ones with Maria had to be with 2 nuns buried as Anastasia and Maria, who died in 1964, and they were actually buried under their names. They claimed they were taken in by a priest in the Ural Mountains in 1919. Alexis Brimeyer actually claimed to be Maria's grandson. He said Maria moved to Romania and had a daughter named Olga Beta, and Brumaire was actually sued by the Association of Descendants of Russian Nobility of Belgium in 1971. And Gabriel Louis Duval had a book called A Princess in the Family, claiming his foster grandmother was Granny Alina, actually Maria Romanov, but they could not identify any claims because her body was too deteriorated. That was Maria's story. She has quite an interesting story, but Margot, the sister of Anne Frank, the Holocaust victim, also has an interesting story. And so she was born in 1926, February 16th, to Edith and Otto Frank. And they were so overjoyed to have a child. And she was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and actually named for her deceased aunt, Bettina Hollander, who died when Edith was 14 of appendicitis. And the Franks' maid, Kathy Stillenbauer, said Margot was a little princess. She was actually concerned that Margot did not do anything wrong because she was so neat and careful. Margot actually grew up in Frankfurt, Germany. She was painfully shy, but she always made friends. And she was loved by her parents and so much alike with her mother. And she loved being a big sister. It was one of the most important jobs in her life. And she wanted to set a good example for her sister Anne. She enjoyed spending time with her family. And originally she went to the Ludwig Richter School. And it was a school that had all religions. They actually studied all major religions. They had big windows, and they had their desks in a U shape, so everyone could talk. She loved the school, and this fostered the love of learning she would have through her life. However, in 1933, due to financial difficulties, they moved in with Margot's grandmother. And then she went to a different school, which had many different rules, and anti-German laws were being set into place. And Margot actually and the other Jewish students had to sit in the back of the classroom. And that was one of the catalysts of their move to Amsterdam. So a little bit about her parents. Otto Frank was a businessman. Edith Hollander was actually the heir to a scrap metal company. And they had their marriage out of respect and convenience. It's hard to say if they really did love each other. They respected each other, sure, and they likely met through friends. They married in 1925, a year before Margot was born. So Margot was able to meet 3 of her grandparents. She had Alice Betty Stern Frank, who is the matriarch of the Frank family. And Margot often corresponded with her, and she corresponded with the entire family. And she was quite wealthy, and her husband Michael dies in 1909, and she died in 1953 in Basel, Switzerland. She did survive because she was in a neutral country. And Abraham Hollander is Edith's father. He died when Margot was around 6 months old. And Rosa Stern Hollander was her grandmother, and she actually stayed with them often. Rosa eventually moved to the Netherlands to actually be with the family, for her safety, in fact. She died of cancer 6 months before the Frank family went into hiding. So she had a lot of extended family and friends. She had Buddy and Stephen Elias, Buddy who became head of the Anne Frank organization eventually. They lived in Switzerland. She had Walter and Julius Hollander, her uncles. They lived in the United States. Gertrude Naumann was sort of like the family babysitter in Germany when they lived there. She took care of everybody. She had so many siblings, and she took care of everybody in the neighborhood, including Margot. There was Hetty Ludo, a friend from Amsterdam, and there was Jedek Freya, her best friend from high school, and the Jewish Lyceum, which you'll see later when she was a teen. There was Barbara Letterman, and Barbara was a friend from early on at school in Germany and Amsterdam as well. So after Margot's experience at the Verentrap School and financial difficulties, they moved to Amsterdam in 1933. She quickly made friends, one being Jedek Freya, and she learned Dutch with almost no accent at the Jecker School. She actually rarely spoke of her time in Germany. She just wanted to focus on the now, and that's actually their apartment in Amsterdam. So Margot did have happy times in her life. She had normal childhood and young adulthood. She spent a lot of time with her friends. She biked a lot. She had trips to the beach. She actually wanted to be a maternity nurse and moved to Palestine. She was so talented at sports. She played tennis just like her mother had. She was a star rower. Her rowing team actually won medals a couple years in a row. She was a member of a Dutch Zionist group, and she also enjoyed studying. In 1940, the Jecker School was able to correspond with students in the US. Her partner and pen pal was Betty Ann Wagner, and actually had Betty Ann's younger sister as her pen pal. And it was the opportunity to write to other students their age internationally. And these letters actually show Margot's awareness of what is going on in Europe in 1940. She writes to Betty Ann, "We often listen to the radio, as times are very exciting. Having a frontier with Germany and being a small country, we never feel safe." In 1941, there's even more heartbreak and crushing moments. She was forced to leave the Jecker School to go to an all-Jewish school called the Jewish Lyceum, and she was kicked off her rowing team because the Jewish kids could no longer be on sports teams. Her rowing team actually disbanded in protest of that law, but still she could no longer row on it, and she finally had to go to another school. And she was often seen outside her old school on her bike. Her friend Hetty Lass said, "I think she really missed her old school and her non-Jewish friends." Eventually, she was called up to work camp, and this is the catalyst that sends the Frank family into hiding. She received notice to report to work camp in Germany in July of 1942. And she secretly rode her bike at 7 a.m. in the morning with Miep Gies, who helped hide the Frank family. At 7 a.m., she left home. She did not show intimidation until she was inside. I gripped her arm to give her courage, and she disappeared behind the door, and I took my place in the front office, Miep says. Margot was completely shattered as soon as she entered the annex. She had no idea what lied ahead for her. And in the annex, she actually shared a room with her parents, which is extremely strange and must be uncomfortable for a 16-year-old girl. She became very withdrawn. She didn't really talk much to anybody, and she studied several subjects so she wouldn't be behind if she ever got out. What most people don't know is she actually had her own diary, but it was never found. And that's possibly because she hid it in a drawer. So when the Frank family was betrayed in August of 1944, they went to Westerbork concentration camp. Nobody knows if anyone betrayed them, but a possible person is Arnold van den Berg, and he was actually in the news recently as a Jewish man who was actually turning other Jewish people in so he could have the ability to stay around and not go to a concentration camp. So he kind of turned in his own fellow man for his own benefits. We do not know for sure if it was him, but it is possible, but it could have been anything, the light on at the wrong time or anything like that. So when they were sent to the camp and forced out of the annex, Margot was weeping silently. She had no idea what was going on and if she would ever see her life the same way again. So Margot and Edith, her mother Edith, were originally not selected for Auschwitz. They were actually selected for a Libau labor camp, but they decided to stay with Anne because she was not chosen for that camp. She had scabies, and people with scabies could not go to that labor camp. So they went to Auschwitz on September 3rd, 1944, and the first thing that happened when they got there was the men and women were separated. so she was separated from her father. And Otto claims, "I shall remember the look in Margot's eyes all my life." At the end of October, there was a selection for Bergen-Belsen, and Margot and Anne were chosen. They went at the end of October and early November, and this camp was actually worse in the way that it was overcrowded. There was almost no food or water, and typhus was going on. There were outbreaks all the time of disease, and you couldn't have a blanket without lice on it. So eventually, when the typhus outbreak came, Margot became ill with it first. And she actually passed away in February of 1945. Anne took care of Margot until she died. So it's kind of seeing the reverse scenario. Margot taking care of Anne all her life, Anne now taking care of Margot. And then eventually Anne got sick and she died as well a few days or a week later. And they were buried in the same mass grave by the Brandis-Billis-Lippers sisters. One of them, Jannie, was a nurse who cared for the sick. They actually knew the Franks from Amsterdam, and they informed Otto of their deaths. And it's interesting, a theory why Margot's diary was not found is she had it in a drawer, and the drawer was sold to a German family, and they just simply threw it out, as Anne's was out and on the floor. So Margot had several friends that survived the war, and we'll talk about a couple of them here. Jedek Freya actually became a librarian and a nurse. She came from an interesting family. Her father was a professor of economics. Her brother was active in the resistance and actually executed. And Jedek actually died recently in 2017. Hetty Ludel was very close to Margot and died in 2003. She originally moved in South Africa, and she gave Otto the letters that she had been writing to Margot after the war. Barbara Letterman and her family got false papers and hid and worked for the resistance. She eventually moved to the US. Lorene Nussbaum remained close to Otto, but she eventually became a professor in Portland for German languages. And Hilde Jacobsthal also received false papers. She was an ambulance driver and for the Red Cross. She went first to Palestine and then the US. And after the war, for a little while, Jedek had a little envy of all the attention Otto was giving Anne's diary. She said, "I think it's wonderful what you are doing for Anne, but I think it's a pity that nothing is mentioned anymore about Margot. She is also worthy of being mentioned." And in 2011, something very exciting happened for Margot's friends. The Anne Frank Museum did a temporary exhibit on Margot, and many of her friends that survived, or classmates, came to the exhibit. There's a picture of them right there. And some of them wanted Margot to be represented somehow for many years. And actually, Jedek made a special donation for that exhibit. She gave the Anne Frank Museum a message Margot wrote to her in her diary in summer of 1941. It says, "Times change, people change. Thoughts about good and evil change, about what is true and false. But what always remains fast and steady is the affection that your friends feel for you, those who always have your best interest at heart." And in the end, Jedek knew Margot would not have wanted her private thoughts exposed to the world, and that is why maybe it's fate that her diary was not found. And so her legacy represents one of the millions of voices lost among Holocaust victims and stories that will never be completely told. And she was, like many, a young woman killed just because of prejudice. So both these women died as young adults. They both have famous siblings, and the goal was really to now get to know them and their stories a little bit better. And here are some of my sources here, and some photographs. Any questions?